Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to our special COVID-19 conference series. We have another great conference featuring three terrific panelists who are all experts on the topic of fighting anti-Semitism, which is frighteningly metastasizing not just across the globe and across our country, but also in particular on our nation's college campuses. As the Endowment for Middle East Truth's New York chapter president, I thank you all for joining again. EMET means truth in Hebrew, and as one of Washington, D.C.'s premier think tanks, we strive daily to bring truth to the narrative surrounding the Middle East and Israel more specifically. Unfortunately, the truth no longer exists on college campuses, and the lies directed at Israel and discrimination against Jewish students have become so pervasive that even the numerous organizations established to fight this are struggling to keep up with the hate. Today, we have representatives from three organizations that are doing their part to try and win the daily battles so that our campuses are safe for Jewish students and so that our future leaders learn the truth, the EMET. As anti-Semitism flourishes, often disguised as anti-Zionism, we here at EMET are working tirelessly to promote the truth in furtherance of support for America and Israel's national security. Even during COVID, we continue our daily work on Capitol Hill, virtually with meetings with senators, congressmen, and their staffers to develop and implement pro-America and pro-Israel policies with great success. Our work is critical to the survival of the Jewish people, both in Israel and the diaspora, and I urge you all to learn more about EMET by visiting our website at www.emetonline.org. Please consider supporting us as our work is critically important, and any financial donations are much appreciated. With anti-Semitism often in the form of anti-Zionism seemingly permissible across college campuses, Jewish students have been left to confront this millennia-old hatred on their own. President Trump signed an executive order that protections to Jews.
Froze. Uh-oh. Lauri, you froze? So, Lauri, are you frozen? Would you like me to go on from you, or would you? There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know where I left off, but I mentioned the Trump
executive order. Right.
Okay, I'm sorry, everybody, for the technical difficulties. Hopefully that's the first and the last issues. Can you hear me?
You froze again a little bit, but just go on and, you know.
We're fortunate to have esteemed panelists that are joining that work together with EMET, and we have Sarah Stern, EMET's president founder, as well as Asaf Romirowsky, who is the executive director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, of which I'm a board member and the treasurer, and Alyza Lewin, who is the president and counsel of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights and Law. I'm not going to take time to read their lengthy and impressive resumes, which were attached to the invitation, but Sarah, Asaf, and Alyza are all brilliant thinkers and warriors who have spent their professional careers addressing the problem of systemic anti-Semitism on college campuses, and I'm honored to call them friends. We all work together, and we're all here as resources for you. Please visit the SPME and Brandeis websites as well to learn more about the important work that they're doing, and you know, I'm happy that you're all joining the call and have a chance to hear their thoughts on all of these issues. I'm going to spend the first part of the conference discussing the important issues with them, posing some questions to them, and then I'll open it up to questions from you all. If you have any questions you'd like to send to me to read, you can send them to my email at lregan@emetonline.org. Asaf, I'm going to start with you. Can you spend few minutes discussing what you see going on campuses these days? Even in the midst of the pandemic, we're seeing some really bad things occurring to both students and faculty. One of the more recent events was the horrible situation at University of Southern California with a young Jewish woman who was forced to resign as vice president of the undergraduate student government due to, it was months of harassment because she was a Jew and an outspoken Zionist. Yesterday, we had a win, but San Francisco State University was attempting to host the proud terrorist Leila Khaled on a webinar. And then we have Harvard University, which just hired Palestinian Authority Saeed Arakat to mentor students in diplomacy, which is an irony in and of itself. There's a lot packed in there, but can you spend some time to share with us what you're seeing play out and what you think might be occurring in the near term?
Sure. Well, thank you, Lauri. It's a pleasure to be here and to join everybody, friends and colleagues on this esteemed panel. And appreciate the hospitality. So with the short time that I have, let me kind of give an overview of what I see, what I've been observing over the past 20 years that I've been in this rodeo, so to speak. Israel today, more than ever, is still a litmus test for what it means to be a liberal, progressive individual on campus. Whether you are a student or a faculty, how one perceives Israel in their conversation is a testament to one's rank and file membership, especially if you're a faculty member, but also how you are seen when it comes to student activism. As we saw with the case study, Lauri, you were referring to what happened with Rose Bridge, in Southern California, where again, you saw a clear example where students are asked to basically put aside their Zionism at the door when they step into a conversation. And so I would argue, if you're looking at the environment, while all of us, I think, believe and know to be true that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are indeed synonymous and one and the same, something that we are clear and ratified now by the IHRA definition, which has been adopted by the State Department. And I know that we're going to talk about that a little later on. But I would argue that still in North America, there is still an ongoing healthy debate about trying to create and to validate that wedge between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to argue that one is legitimate criticism, that is, of course, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism is racism. So I don't want to be called a racist, I am just an anti-Zionist. And so when you see that narrative playing into the conversation on American college campuses, you see this is where the normalizing of anti-Semitism is taking place under the guise of legitimate arguments, which, I would argue that they are not. I think that they are one and the same. And I think that if you test out the environment today, I would argue that I would say that since 9/11, while the environment in general has gotten somewhat better, you are seeing much more student and faculty empowerment as a result of the work that many of us are doing on campus and trying to help balance the environment. But the animosity and the opposition is much better in the way that they are on messaging. There's a lot more money going into that environment, and they are monolithic in their perspective. And so, interestingly enough, you're looking at this, environment today, just to kind of put it in a perspective. Today, the religiosity of the day is rooted in identity politics, intersectionality, which are the code phrases for kind of looking at people. I feel it must be true, and the hierarchy of intersectionality, which is basically based on the fallacious idea in the pyramid that all oppressed groups are somehow linked, and there's no more oppressed group in the gold standard than the Palestinian narrative. So if you are seeing yourself as part of a progressive, liberal agenda, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, peace and conflict rights, you have to support the Palestinian narrative no matter what. That is also the case, of course, and above all, which has become vividly exemplified within the Black Lives Matter movement. And, if you add to all of that, of course, it is, which is a symptom of this problem, is, of course, the cancel culture environment. Anybody who does not ascribe to this orthodoxy, including faculty and professors, and this is something that we're, as PME, we spend a great deal of time mobilizing academics in this environment. If you do not subscribe to this orthodoxy, you are going to be shunned, you are going to be marginalized, and to a point where you will be sued. We've seen a variety of cases since April alone. I recently wrote an article about this topic. One of a black professor at Brown University by the name of Glenn Lauri, who is somebody that I recommend looking at, who was a political economist who used to work for Ronald Reagan, actually is the individual who compiled that list of the cancel culture individuals throughout North America and in Europe, who's basically going and looked at faculty, people in journalists and whatnot, who are all facing this environment if you're basically daring to break the orthodoxy of the day. The connotation today that, and within this kind of narrative of cancel culture, the only form of hate speech that is accepted within cancel culture is, of course, anti-Semitism. So you see this kind of environment spreading, throughout this larger architecture. And it doesn't matter, if you're looking even today during the environment of COVID, whether or not campuses are in session or online, the vitriol of anti-Semitism continues. I mean, you could see it, talk about what's happening, over the past 2 days. Currently at Columbia University, they're holding a BDS referendum. It took, Columbia has been in many regards ground zero for a lot of this activism. It was the home base of the late Palestinian activist Edward Said. You don't have to look deep, to find that kind of pro-Palestinianization, or what I would consider to be the adaptation of Palestinian propaganda replacing scholarship, which has been happening across the board at large. But it took Lee Bollinger, the current president of Columbia, who's been there, only a few months ago, to actually say that BDS is wrong. But we have a long history at Columbia University going back to the days when they hosted Ahmadinejad and other kind of individuals on campus. But what is it taking now individuals to step up? I think is also quite telling about the environment and how toxic it's gotten as a result of the larger environment. It takes a lot of courage. That's another part that it's critical to understand. Universities should be places of the exchange of ideas and discourse. That is not happening. BDS is not about facts. Facts don't matter within the BDS narrative. The UAE-Bahrain agreement has no impact whatsoever on the environment at large. The anti-normalization is the #1 issue. And when you're looking at all of these ingredients to play into the campus environment, this directly comes, as it has always been, directly out of a PLO playbook. Apropos the Palestinians are taking place today. The PLO playbook was very clear back in the 1960s that all you had to do was basically take over or win over using what we consider to be in the social sciences agents of influence or soft power, and that is done through journalism and academia. And that's exactly what you're seeing, the byproduct of the environment today, where ground zero and the fertile environment for cascading this fallacious narrative, this one-sided narrative, where basically the David and Goliath metaphor has shifted. Israel is now the clear Goliath, and the Palestinians are the David, all featured within the kind of the modality of settler colonialism. Jews are white supremacists, and basically by extension, everything that the state of Israel does is because Zionism is indeed racism based on this narrative. Jews are indeed racist, so they're not allowed to be included within the campus discourse, and that goes for students and for faculty alike. And what you're seeing today as a result of the Rose Rich case, which is very similar to what happened with Rachel Beda at UCLA, people are asked to basically put aside their Zionism, as if to say that Zionism is not an integral part of Jewish identity, which also relates again to what I was describing before, where this environment that anti-Semitism, that is okay racism. We don't want to be a racist. We're only going to be anti-Zionist, even though, and of late, which is interesting, I think, to look at the environment today, much of the old definition of anti-Semitism was rooted in Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds. Sharansky then again went back and tweaked his 3 Ds and basically is saying today that the environment, when he actually authored the 3 Ds, is much worse than it was when he first came out with that definition. And I think that is basically the environment that we're in. To that end, positively, I think that where we are seeing some successes, related to what your comment about yesterday, Lauri, in the area of the legal realm, in the area of lawfare, we are seeing some movement of exposure. We are seeing, that there's more naming and shaming going on. We are seeing that there's a lot more transparency, that universities are being looked at. University presidents are indeed politicians, and they are looked at very carefully as what's going on. Beyond all of that, I think that, of course, the Title VI executive order that was signed by President Trump is also another positive toolbox in our ability to combat this narrative. To that end, I think our challenge today is actually to help implement that on the majority of campuses, because that is also not clear to the administrators. Is this exactly discrimination or not? And that's where a lot of our work is taking place these days, given the political toxicity in the environment. And I think that, again, what happens on campus doesn't end on campus, and actually is a symptom of this cultural problem that we're seeing today that really talks, which is really about Western civilization, where Israel falls into this larger paradigm. So I'll end here, and then we can go on from there, but thank you.
Thanks, Asaf. You covered a lot, and a lot of the things that you touched on we're going to probably discuss in greater detail as we go through the afternoon or the next hour. Sarah, I know you've spent years and years working on issues relating to Title VI, which Asaf just mentioned. There's Title VI of the Higher Education Act, as well as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and you wrote a brilliant essay in the Jewish Policy Center's spring issue of Insight magazine on the topic of using Title VI protections to stop campus anti-Semitism. Can you share with the audience the issues pertaining to both legislative initiatives and discuss your efforts to protect Jewish students, as well as to stop the indoctrination which is resulting from foreign funds being pumped into universities? If you have time, maybe touch on the president's executive order, but again, we'll be talking about that as the conference goes on.
Okay, many people confuse Title VI of the Higher Education Act and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. They're two different animals, but they're like intersecting Venn diagrams, and there is some overlap. Title VI of the Higher Education Act had its genesis with very good intentions. Right after the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, people here in Washington realized that most American students were woefully ill-equipped to compete against the Soviet threat. So they set aside a pot of money in 1958, which was supposed to go for regional studies centers, African studies, Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies. And then it got folded in 1965 into Title VI of the Higher Education Act. It was first called the National Defense Education Act. And the intention of both of these was to raise a generation of students that would want to defend the national security interests of the United States. But unfortunately, the original legislative intent has been really turned on its head. The biggest thing that revolutionized this was the advent of Edward Said's book that Asaf mentioned from Columbia University in 1978 called Orientalism. And the basic doctrine of that is no one is entitled to speak with any legitimacy about the region unless they were from the region, i.e. an Arab. So wonderful scholars like Bernard Lewis got cast aside, and this became de rigueur. It's a very simplistic kind of theorem, but it spread like wildfire throughout college campuses. And unfortunately, right now, what we have, and this is where these Venn diagrams intersect, are Title VI campuses, and even if they don't get Title VI funding, most Middle Eastern studies professors and most campuses throughout the United States are dominated with people who are rabidly anti-Israel, anti-Western imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-American, and what our students are receiving is paltry, one-sided propaganda as a horrible substitute for a good, well-rounded education. Now, in 2008, I thought I had hit upon a cure for this, and I worked with Martin Kramer, who wrote the seminal book about this issue called Ivory Towers on Sand, which I would recommend to anyone. And as I think, I respect Asaf so much, but I think that actually situation has gotten worse, not better. But that's just my feeling, and I respect you tremendously. But and Ivory Towers on Sand is still as relevant today. He came out with this, I think, in 2001. But it is an amazing book which talks about the failure of Middle Eastern studies. So now we have Rashad Khalidi, who was a spokesperson and a press agent for Yasser Arafat, who sits in the Edward Said Chair of Columbia University. where I went to school, it's like Berzit University on the Hudson. And Georgetown University, we have Esposito, John Esposito, who essentially, he has testified before Congress, and he has said Hezbollah and Hamas are not terrorist groups. We should have links with them. And he wrote something for the Harvard International Review saying that we should reach out to Hamas and Hezbollah because they have, you know, they're a political wing and as opposed to a terrorist wing. And of course, yesterday we had Professor Rahab Abdul-Hadi, who has ties with Hamas, and she invited Leila Khalid, that Asaf mentioned, who is a hijacker. That is her only claim to fame, and I don't see why that gives her credentials to sit in a prestigious academic forum. And we don't see anything on the other side. There is a steady diet of anti-American, anti-Western, and particularly anti-Israel propaganda. And what bothers me the most about this is that in order to get the funding, the professors have to do teacher training workshops, and I call this trickle-down propaganda. And they all refer to this book by Audrey Shabazz as a curriculum guide, and that it is incredibly anti-Israel. They read the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. It's just a steady stream of propaganda, and this has been going on now for 20 years. So it's no wonder that by the time kids go to campus, no matter what's going on in North Korea, no matter what's going on in Turkey, no matter what's going on in Syria, the one nation state that kids feel that they have got to rally against is the one little democracy in the Middle East, Israel. Now, in terms of the December 11th, 2019 executive order, I was delighted when the president issued this. It had actually taken the same exact language as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which had been sponsored by Senator Tim Scott, wonderful, from South Carolina, and Ben Casey from Pennsylvania on the Senate side. And there was a nice group, bipartisan group, when it went over to the House. I was assured by one member of Congress, who I'd rather not mention, on the Democratic side, that he would introduce it. It never got introduced by him. And Congressman Doug Collins, who is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, introduced it. It got a nice number of co-sponsors. And then at the moment that the president introduced the act, I think everybody stopped because they felt, okay, we've got this executive order, we don't need the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And what the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and the executive order does is amend or just make a qualification to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which talks about how although Title VI of the Civil Rights Act does not mention religion, both the Justice Department and the Department of Education recognize discrimination for Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups. And therefore, we do have certain rights under the Constitution. I'm worried about what's going to happen, you know, at the end of this administration. Just this week on September 17th, Virginia Fox, who is the minority chair of the Education and Workforce Education and Labor Committee, introduced the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, which basically would give Jewish students the right to seek legal redress when they feel that they are being discriminated against. And it did pass. Unfortunately, 162 Democrats voted no, but it did pass. And then it was sent over to the Senate, and we are now in the process of seeing whether or not the Senate is going to take it up as well. So there is a lot of work to be done. A tremendous amount of work to be done. And, I'm trying to compress a lot of work, years of work into 6 minutes or less. And I also want to thank Asaf and Alyza Lewin for the wonderful work of their organizations. And I know that one of the things that Alyza does, which I love, is the jigsaw initiative, which helps because all of us have very small organizations and none of us can be on every college campus. But this empowers law students to help undergraduates or others who have felt discriminated against to go ahead and file lawsuits so that we can take action here. So.
Thanks, Sarah. You actually answered another question that I have for you for later in the program. So we still have a lot to talk about. And Alyza, we can come back to the lawfare because I was actually going to ask you that later on in the program also. But right now, I wanted to ask you that, you've spent the better part of your career dealing with fighting anti-Semitism, both as a lawyer and at the Brandeis Center, dealing with campus issues. Asaf and I wrote a column in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago launching SPME's initiative to petition college administrators to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which recognizes that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. Asaf touched on this, but can you go into a little bit more depth in discussing the reasoning behind the idea that anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism, and also explain why the adoption of the IHRA definition is not an infringement on individual free speech rights, which is the main argument that opponents to its adoption have used?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, I want to thank you, Lauri, for inviting me. It's always such a pleasure to work side by side with you and with Sarah and with Asaf. So being here today is just an honor and a pleasure, and I thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.
When you ask about IHRA and the IHRA definition, so there really are, I think, two significant miscomprehensions, right? One of the main problems we have when it comes to anti-Semitism is a comprehension problem. So the first comprehension problem is that much of society today doesn't even understand what anti-Semitism is, right? Many people who think they understand anti-Semitism, the only anti-Semitism that they recognize is anti-Semitism that resembles the Holocaust. So for example, if they see a swastika, they know that's anti-Semitic. If they hear a Nazi or a white supremacist, they say, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Maybe if they will see somebody who's identifiably Jewish, somebody who has peyot, who has side curls, or a yarmulke, who is attacked, right? There's a stabbing in Muncie. They'll go, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Or a synagogue, somebody breaks into a synagogue and shoots. That they'll say, okay, that's anti-Semitic. But that's about it, right? What the problem is that many people in society today, even those who are knowledgeable about the Holocaust, they don't understand that anti-Semitism not only caused the Holocaust, but that anti-Semitism existed for centuries before the Holocaust. And what they don't realize is that anti-Semitism looks a little different in each generation. It morphs. And the one and only constant when it comes to anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism always seeks to pin whatever is that generation's greatest evil on the Jew. Because anti-Semitism always seeks to demonize, marginalize, ostracize, exclude, or today, cancel the Jew, right? First, the Jew is the Christ killer. For socialists, the Jew is the capitalist. For capitalists, the Jew is the socialist. For the Nazis, the Jew is the ultimate race polluter. Whatever each generation finds most appalling, right? Whatever that society views as its greatest evil, that is pinned on the Jew. The Jew is demonized. Anti-Semites target the Jews as the source of whatever that problem is, right? The Jew is blamed for society's misfortune and for all that's bad. And the implication is that, well, if only the Jews would disappear, the world would be a better place. So think about it. What is today's current evil, right? What's the issue that has upended our society and led to riots in the United States? Racism, apartheid, settler colonialism. And lo and behold, who has society deemed the greatest offender of these evils? It's not just individual Jews, but it's the Jewish collective, right? The Jewish nation state of Israel, the one and only true democracy in the Middle East, the one place in that region of the world where all faiths, all races, all ethnicities, all genders are equal under the law. That one country, the Jewish homeland, is singled out and demonized. That is today's anti-Semitism, but much of society today doesn't comprehend contemporary anti-Semitism. And that's reason number one why the IHRA definition is so crucially important. Because the IHRA definition teaches the world, it's an educational tool, and it teaches that anti-Semitism today is not limited to the anti-Semitism that looks like the Holocaust, right? Anti-Semitism today also targets and demonizes the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel. Irwin Cutler, a former Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, he once said, and I paraphrase, but it was said just perfectly, because he explained that traditional anti-Semitism sought to marginalize and ostracize the individual Jew, right, and deny the Jew his place in society. But today's contemporary or modern anti-Semitism is seeking to deny and to marginalize and demonize the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel, and deny it its place in the society of nations. So that's our first challenge, is to educate society which doesn't understand what anti-Semitism even is and can't recognize it. The second miscomprehension, and that goes to what Asaf was saying earlier when he said that, well, lawfare has started to work a little bit more. The laws can only work, right? When Sarah talks about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Jews have been protected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Both Democrats and Republicans, though Democratic administrations and Republican administrations have recognized that discrimination against Jews or any other group on the basis of their shared ancestral and ethnic characteristics provides them protection on the basis of national origin discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So Jews, Sikhs, Muslims, groups that share a common faith are protected from discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. What the executive order did is it linked the IHRA definition to Title VI, because many people, again, don't understand what national origin discrimination against Jews look like. They think that national origin discrimination against Jews means somebody says, I will not hire an Israeli. That's not it. I mean, that is national origin discrimination against Jews who are Israelis, but national origin discrimination is not limited to that, right? National origin discrimination against Jews means discrimination against Jews on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. What is the Jews' shared ancestry and ethnicity? The Jews' shared ancestry and ethnicity is their Zionism, right? And so the problem has been, and this, Asaf, is why I think things are starting to turn around, is because the second miscomprehension that makes it difficult to combat anti-Semitism today is that most people are either unable or maybe unwilling to distinguish between a discussion of Israel's policies on the one hand and statements of support for the Jewish homeland that are for many Jews an expression of their pride in their Jewish ethnic identity on the other. So Judaism is both a faith and an ethnicity. Jews share not only religious traditions, but also a deep historical sense of Jewish peoplehood. And our Jewish history, theology, and culture are deeply intertwined with the land of Israel. I don't know if you know, but over half of the 613 commandments in the Pentateuch are actually connected to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel, right? For centuries, Jews have not only prayed facing Jerusalem, they've prayed to return to Jerusalem. Right? Zionism as a political movement may have started and originated in the 19th century with Theodor Herzl. But the desire and determination of Jews to return to their ancestral homeland in Israel, that is thousands of years old and goes all the way back to Abraham, Moses, and the children of Israel in their exodus from Egypt to the promised land, right? Zionism is as integral to Judaism as observing the Jewish Sabbath or maintaining a kosher diet. You may say to me, how can you say that, Alyza? Well, look, of course, not all Jews observe Shabbat or keep kosher. But those who do are clearly expressing an important component of their Jewish identity. And similarly, not all Jews are Zionists, but for many Jews, identifying with and expressing support for the Jewish homeland is also a sincere and deeply felt expression of their Jewish religious and ethnic identity. So when Jews express pride in the fact that there's a country where the national calendar is the Jewish calendar, right? So they don't need to take vacation days to celebrate their religious holidays. And students don't have to worry that they may have an exam on Yom Kippur or Shavuot. Right? When Jews are excited that there's a country where kosher food is easily available, where the ancient Jewish language of Hebrew is the spoken language, where Jews are free to practice their faith with pride, where Jewish culture is flourishing, where one can walk on stones that are the same stones that the ancient Jewish people walked on 3,000 years ago. When we celebrate that, that's an example of Jews celebrating their shared ancestry and ethnicity. It's not necessarily a statement of support for the political policies of the current government of Israel. And it's not a statement that suggests dual loyalty. Yet today, on campuses and beyond, right? It's everywhere. Jews who express this kind of support for a Jewish homeland, who take pride in the accomplishments of the Jewish people, and they celebrate that all that the Jewish collective, right, the Jewish nation state of Israel contributes to the world in the areas of high tech and agriculture and medicine and art and science and more, those people are being tarred and feathered, right? They're being called racist Zionists or supporters of apartheid or settler colonialists. And those are the categories that today are considered this generation's greatest evil, right? So today, Jews are repeatedly told that if they want to be good citizens of the world, if they want to join progressive movements and march for civil or human rights, they want to join and march for women's rights or LGBTQ rights or climate change or immigration reform, what's the condition? They first are told they have to shed this part of their Jewish identity. They have to abandon their sense of Jewish peoplehood and ethnic pride. They have to disavow the Jewish homeland. There's no other community that's charged this kind of a price for admission. And demanding that Jews shed any part of their identity as the price for admission is discriminatory and anti-Semitic. You could compare it to demanding that a Catholic student disavow the Vatican or a Muslim student requiring him or her to shed his or her connection to Mecca, right? Excluding an individual in this matter on the basis of his or her identity is discrimination, and it's time for the world to recognize that this is today's anti-Semitism. And we have to articulate it and talk about it this way, right? Because the law is only going to apply if we can express it and explain that Jews who are trying to express this part of their identity are being marginalized and excluded, and that is discrimination and harassment. Then you can use the laws. If people continue to think that all you're talking about is a political disagreement, then you say, what do you want? Especially here in this country where the First Amendment protects speech that you may find offensive, right? Even hate speech is protected in this country. You can't use the law if what you're talking about is just a political disagreement. But you can use the law when people start to understand that what we're talking about is a very deliberate, determined effort to marginalize and exclude Jews who are celebrating and their ethnic pride, right? Who are exhibiting ethnic pride. Combating anti-Semitism is a global human rights issue. Anti-Semitism undermines democratic values of respect, inclusion, and equality. And it's a cancer that rots away at, decays, and ultimately destroys the societies that fail to curb it. Now, why is the IHRA definition so essential? Because it's not possible to effectively combat this enemy if we refuse to define it, right? And defining anti-Semitism requires us to recognize it in all of its manifestations. That means that we have to understand that anti-Semitism comes from both the right and the left. It utilizes traditional anti-Semitic tropes to demonize not only individual Jews, but also the Jewish collective, the state of Israel. And anti-Semitism seeks to deny Jews the rights to which all human beings are entitled, including the right to equal opportunity, whether it's on campuses and beyond, regardless of national or ethnic identity. And that's the example, as Asaf was talking about, of Rose Rich, right? She was the vice president of student government at the University of Southern California, and she became the target of an aggressive social media campaign that sought to, quote, impeach her Zionist ass, close quote. She was forced to resign to protect her own physical safety and her mental health. And she was denied the opportunity to complete her term as vice president solely on the basis of her identity as a Zionist, proud Zionist Jew. So universities, social media platforms, federal, state, local governments, all of them should be adopting the IHRA definition in its entirety, including all of the examples that it provides of contemporary anti-Semitism, right? The people who oppose the adoption are anti-Semites who don't want to be labeled as anti-Semites. They want to be able to preach anti-Semitism, but not be canceled as a racist Jew hater. right? And if we carve out exceptions and recognize only some forms of anti-Semitism and not others, right? So if we allow student governments, for instance, say, well, we'll only adopt some of the examples from the IHRA definition and not others, maybe they might say, oh, it's okay to demonize the Jewish collective and compare Israelis to Nazis. Or maybe they might say, it's okay to delegitimize Jews by denying the Jewish right to self-determination. That statement, by the way, and we can talk about this more later, is the equivalent of demanding that Jews shed their historic yearning to return to Zion. If you say that any of that's okay, then what we're doing is severely undermining our ability to confront anti-Semitic hate. If you're going to apply only parts of the IHRA definition and not others, that's the equivalent of constructing a massive gate through which Jew haters are going to drive a semi-trailer truck full of anti-Semitic hate. So we have to utilize the IHRA definition as a guide. It doesn't mean, as you said, squelching criticism of Israel, right? The IHRA definition explicitly states, and I quote, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So the IHRA definition doesn't prohibit anti-Semitic speech. It just labels as anti-Semitic the attacks that, as Asaf said, use Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, the attacks that use traditional anti-Semitic tropes to demonize, delegitimize, or apply a double standard to the Jewish homeland. And so we have to use this IHRA definition as an educational tool, right, if we're going to want to curb anti-Semitism.
Thanks so much, Alyza. Again, another answer packed full of so much information, so much to cover today, but thanks for that. Asaf, I'm going to go back to actually what you started you touched on very briefly, which was, in a recent column, you recognize that anti-Semitism is the only form of hate speech that cancel culture has no problem tolerating, while pro-Israel stances remain occasions to cancel those who dare to express it. Can you talk about the BDS campaign more generally? Who's promoting it? How do we fight it? How does intersectionality, what role does that play in all of the discrimination against Jews on campus? And how do we reach, if possible, the public at large, donors and trustees, college administrators and faculty, to allow Jewish voices to be treated as part of these major equity and diversity initiatives that are now being, that are taking place across campuses in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and even prior to the Black Lives Matter movement? How do we prevent Jews from being caught up in the cancel culture?
Sure. Well, just to be clear, so one point that I just want to point of clarification to Alyza and Sarah's point. I mean, my point before, I actually think the environment hasn't gotten much worse, not better. I mean, I think that what we are seeing now is a normalization of anti-Semitism. What I was saying was that the only places where we've seen some successes, and this ties into your question, Lauri, as well, where we've been able to penetrate and hold some of these institutions accountable is in the space of lawfare. And so we've seen, that have helped us in our toolbox. I don't think the environment is any better. I actually think it's much worse, given the general normalization of anti-Semitism has become much more acceptable in American society at large. So I just want to be, to point out, to make that a clear point. To your point, Lauri, I think that we are seeing, I think the case study, for example, of what happened with Oberlin. So Oberlin, as a result of what happened, as a result of people like Jasbar Puar and other kind of individuals that were at Oberlin who were kind of conspiracy theorists, claimed that 9/11, the responsibility on Jews and other kind of cases of the sorts like that, has lost a lot of money as a result of as far as donors not giving money. I think that, there, places like Vassar, who also were under a lot of heat as a result of the good work that, that our friend and colleague, and Alyza's colleague, Ken Marcus, has done, opening up cases at places like Rutgers, San Francisco State. There is much more volume of cases. It takes a long time, to Alyza's point. And, unless these cases are brought and there's enough actual information and data and evidence to go after these institutions, nothing is going to happen. And so again, you're talking about accountability and transparency. Most Americans, their first line of giving is to their alma maters. They want to, for better or for worse, they want to send their kids and grandkids and give to the institutions and believe in many ways that where they are sending their kids is the same place they went to. Unless they are going to speak up and talk about these institutions and what they represent, there's not going to be much pressure. Universities are only going to be held accountable if they feel it in their purses. It's ironic, of course, that in American society, the two largest populations that have invested the most amount of capital in higher education, Jews and Catholics, those same institutions are now being turned on, as a result of the environment. And so BDS is a very succinct and a very simple, digestible issue that is why it's so attractive. And this goes into the understanding, many of my colleagues here, Sarah and Alyza and Lauri, you were talking about, is of course the fact that Jews are indeed racist. So if Jews are indeed racist, everything by extension that they do is considered falls within that platform. And so they are the root cause of all problems that is basically, seen in the world. And the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is perceived as the original sin. And so everything that, all the ailments of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic are basically parachuted and blamed on Jews. So Jews, professors, and students, for that matter, are said, you explain to me how you guys are so racist. The IDF is so racist. There is a growing interpretation of the conflict through what is considered to be Holocaust inversion. Everything in Israel, every Israeli leader is a Nazi. Refugee camps or concentration camps. Jews are worse than Nazis. That is the understanding of the world at large. So BDS is fed into this and is played into this, very clear narrative where the same faculty are teaching based on this narrative. Going back to Sarah's point about the question of Said, the fact of the matter is that the majority of individuals who teach Middle East studies are either come of Arab descent, sympathetic to the Arab cause, Palestinian narrative, and the Jews who teach, or the Israelis who are part of that, are indeed basically, pro-Palestinian Israelis. So you have these token Israelis, token Jews who play into this conversation. And so, part of the awareness and the transparency is breaking the fact that what is the role of the university and what you should be teaching when it comes to these issues. And I think that that's part of where donor stakeholders, need to be, called upon to say, this is not okay. This is not our university. And I think that within the environment of cancel culture, where students are refusing to accept any other kind of narrative. They're saying if they're not being spoon-fed, then, we don't like the idea, then, we have to throw a temper tantrum, which is what we've seen all around the country. When Black Lives Matter first came to the scene, there was a famous case a few years ago. I'm sure some of the audience has seen on YouTube when a student at Yale was shrieking at her professor and yelling, as far as claiming minority rights. The kind of antics and hysteria that has basically been linked to all of this is absurd. The role of the university, in an American institution, in a Western institution, is to provide, tools to think, inquisitive research, thinking, and whatnot. And we're not here to provide everything on a silver platter. You may not like it, but 20, 30 years ago, you go to any campus, you could hear anything you wanted to hear. You may not like it, but you could at least hear it. Today, the tactic is if you don't like it, then basically you're shutting it down. That's where the cancel culture plays into and is fed into all of this. And of course, you can't deny the fact that the political environment of today and the political toxicity has seeped into American college campuses. And so students want to be spoon-fed. Libraries are a dying business. Nobody's reading my book. Nobody cares. Even to Google stuff is a lot. And if it's not an 140 character tweet or an Instagram, nobody's actually reading or learning anything. And so part of the problem is, really, how do we actually transmit information and knowledge? And so we have to get beyond the propaganda, which is what I was starting to talk about before, where there is a replacement of scholarship by propaganda on the one hand, and there's a rise of, apropos yesterday's case, what are considered to be in this country since the 1960s, scholar activists, where they've replaced their scholarship with activism. So going and marching in the quad, or going in to have a Layla Khaled, who basically is using the phraseology of the day, justice. Everything is about justice, and Tikkun Olam has become the religion of the day. That is considered to be and gets the pass for being scholarly work. Or people like Judith Butler, who've been involved with, the Modern Language Association, who considers Hezbollah to be a legitimate organization and freedom fighters of the sort. There is this kind of normalization of the environment to only feed into what is perceived to be as minority rights. And Jews, we are seen as white, privileged, middle-class individuals. We don't fall into that, conversation or that narrative as far as the optics go. So our biggest challenge, to Alyza's point, before, is one, we have to prove that we are minorities, and B, we have to prove that anti-Semitism is racism. Up until now, on many accounts, unless these cases really take more, get more, PR and more ink that's out there, we have failed on these accounts, and we have a difficult time proving that, which is again part of where I think that we have more tools in our toolbox vis-a-vis the IHRA definition and some, and looking at and implementing these definitions. But Lauri, to your point about the question of diversity and equity, you have now institutions like Princeton who is spending close to $700,000 to hire an officer of diversity and equity, where the individuals who are supposed to be implementing what is diversity and equity and who are minorities don't know who these individuals are, and they can't even categorize if this comes on their desks, even identify the problem. That's where the issue takes place here, and actually, to kind of look at this. I think that, positively back in 2012, which I think is something we could be building on, when the American Studies Association first came out with their call for boycott, there were close to hundreds of American university presidents who signed a letter saying that BDS would not be tolerated on their campuses. I think that, now we are in 2020, over, almost 8 years have gone by since that happened, and there is a need to revisit this, and to kind of look at exactly what universities are willing to accept on their campuses. If a student or professor cannot feel safe on their campus, the university is being negligent to what they're supposed to do. And we have to make sure that basic also accommodations are taking place. I mean, I'm sure Alyza can talk about what happened when she even had to teach, and the Brandeis Center at UCLA had to even file a complaint to students. I mean, there's a lot of skill sets that are required, and I think that alumni and parents and teachers have a responsibility. They have an obligation to speak out about what they're going. I mean, here I live in Pennsylvania, and so there was a big to do with Mark Lamont Hill after Mark Lamont Hill with Temple, made his accusations, basically equating, Israel to Hamas and whatnot. And there's a whole YouTube on that that one can Google and see at the United Nations. I mean, people got calls the next day, ironically, and said we want donations for our annual giving, and they said we're not going to give you money until you change what's happening on campus. And I think that universities need to hear that in much bigger volume as to what is taking place. And further, I think that within, we pride ourselves on being, researchers giving information. Students should be given an opportunity to look at both sides of a topic they are studying about. When I teach these topics, and I've taught these topics for years, you provide the Arabic sources, the Hebrew sources, the English sources, you provide all the documents, look at primary documents to actually teach these topics, and you don't give this self-made kind of, conclusions of propaganda. And we have to hold standard of account of what is actually scholarship is about. Otherwise, then the university is not doing its job. And there's a question, why are you paying $70,000 if you could basically go and get that same kind of education in Iran or in Saudi Arabia? We're not. We made ourselves as far as what the Western civilization and what Western institutions should be looking like. And so I think that needs to be looked at very carefully. And I think that it is clearer now, and I think that it's become much clearer as a result of the IHRA definition, that BDS is indeed anti-Semitic. I mean, you don't have to look very far. I think that admittedly, there was a few months ago, one of the co-founders of BDS Movement, Omar Barghouti, was, one of his podcasts was leaked, where he openly admitted that the sole goal is basically the eradication of the state of Israel. It's not about a two-state solution. It's not about peace between the parties. So if you're really trying to figure out what these organizations stand for, this is what their end goal is. They demand the most maximalist goals of every possible thing that would never come to fruition, knowing exactly that they could always label and always blame Israel and Jews by extension of every possible ailment. And if you're looking even at the environment of today, even on the heels of the Abraham Accords, it makes no difference. They're still blaming the Jews for all this to happen. They're still saying that everything has to go through Ramallah. It was intentional. It was an architecture by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu to marginalize and avoid the Palestinians. As a result, we have to be much more supportive of BDS. That's exactly how it's being translated into the campus environment, and that's exactly what you're going to see going forward. And so, long answer to a short question, but none of these are short answers, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, that we could be talking all afternoon and still not touch on everything, but thank you, Asaf. Sarah, I just want, can you touch on the status of legislative initiatives that you've been working on over the past couple of years? And I know you mentioned the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in the context of the executive order, but I think it's important to discuss, if Biden wins, what happens to that executive order? It could go away. And so we need, I think, to still see the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passed. There's also anti-BDS legislation that's been idling in, I believe it's still sitting in the House right now. You did mention the 162 House Democrats that did not support a legislative initiative this past week that would protect Jewish students on campus. Again, I think the anti-BDS legislation is critically important. What is the status of this? It doesn't look like Republicans are going to be taking the House, and we're not sure they're going to retain the Senate. And you have to work on the Hill daily. So I'd love to hear your take on what you see playing out legislatively.
We are really in a very tough spot legislatively. I have to say that Nancy Pelosi controls the House. She controls the agenda. She put Ilhan Omar on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There is very little sympathy in the House. In order to get anything passed, you need both chambers to become, one law of the land. What has happened as opposed to legislation is a number of very wonderful members of Congress, starting with George Holding on April 15th, after this absurd hate fest between the University of North Carolina and the Duke Consortium of Middle Eastern Studies over the conflict over Gaza last March. George Holding wrote to Secretary Betsy DeVos, which opened up an investigation. Since then, we've had Denver legislation right now is really, really tough. What we do have is a number of members of Congress that are willing to take the reign in their own hands. Representative Denver Riggleman did it. He's a Republican of Virginia. He wrote about Georgetown Center for Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies. Paul Gosar did it in February of 2022, of Arizona Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Doug Lamborn wrote to Betsy DeVos on June 16th about Berkeley. Scott DeGeris, a Republican from Tennessee, sent a July 2nd letter about Yale. And then Doug Lamborn again sent a letter to Secretary Betsy DeVos just this week on September 22nd, talking about having University of California, San Francisco host Leila Khalid, which we've spoken about. So it's very, very hard that we have one side of the aisle that is not at all sympathetic. And they've gotten harder. They're looking at their base, and they're seeing, even among American Jews, many of the American Jews, when they go into the voting booth, don't care about Israel. There was a recent study, 1 in 5 list Israel as a priority, and the Democratic Party knows that. And they take the Jewish vote for granted, but unfortunately, without inculcating into our young Jews a good Jewish education where they get a sense of Jewish history and Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood, and they know how fragile the survival of Israel is and what our people have gone through in the past century just to get that tiny little state, they're not going to fight for this and they're not going to make it a priority. So I think a lot of the problem starts with us as Jews in terms of educating our own students. And I also want to say just in general, in terms of, as Alyza spoke, anti-Semitism is the most mutable virus there is. It changes with every generation for whatever it is that we value in that generation. And it is also a harbinger of an internal rot in our society. And I think there is an internal rot in our society because we have gone so far from what John Stuart Mill had spoken about when he spoke about education as the marketplace of ideas. Now it's very conventional. The progressive agenda is actually a very conventional agenda, and they don't teach students to think outside of the box. And I'm very upset about this in terms of what it means for Americans and future Americans, not just in terms of Israel, but in terms of being able to debate, to hold your own, to question, to stand firm on your ground. We've done away with that. It's a diet of a rigid orthodoxy of one side of the debate, and it's tragic for us.
Thank you, Sarah. Alyza, can you share with us the work that you're doing at Brandeis, some of the successes that you've had, but in particular, can you touch on the use of lawfare initiatives, working with the Department of Education? I'm not sure if everybody realizes that the founder of the Brandeis Center is Ken Marcus, who recently stepped down from his position at the Department of Education. He headed up the Office of Civil Rights there and is now back at Brandeis working with Alyza. So Alyza, how do students navigate these issues on campus, and what are you all doing to work with them? And again, the lawfare initiatives would be great to hear about.
Thank you. So at the Brandeis Center, as Sarah mentioned earlier, one of the things, we have three main focus, I would say. It's kind of research and education and the lawfare initiatives, the endeavors. So we are, on the one hand, working with and educating administrators. We've been teaching them what is required of them when it comes to Title VI compliance. How do they navigate that fine line between ensuring that they're not trampling on the First Amendment, but that they are doing what they need to do to protect the students on campus from this hostile environment. So they have to recognize and understand the harassment and discrimination that's going on, and they need actually somebody to guide them as to what steps they should be taking in order to satisfactorily address that. Then we also have a program which we developed to work directly with students, because our focus had been on law schools, right? Our special niche is how do you use the legal toolbox to confront this problem. And we realize that undergraduates have no clue what their rights are. They don't know how to exercise and protect their rights. And quite frankly, they're too intimidated to talk to lawyers. So what we did is we created a program called Jigsaw, which is our justice initiative guiding student activists worldwide. And we created a curriculum to teach law school students the areas of law that they need to understand in order to effectively combat the anti-Semitism on campus. So we teach them about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the executive order, and we teach them about the First Amendment and about principles of academic freedom, and we teach them all of these issues and how to go about using the legal tools to combat anti-Semitism. And what we do is we make them available to the undergraduates. So now we have connected and partnered with the whole array of organizations that actually have the boots on the ground on the campuses. So everyone from the Israel on Campus Coalition and Stand With Us and Hasbara Fellowships. And right, we trained our first group of Jigsaw Fellows on a Hasbara Fellowship trip to Israel. We brought a year and a half ago, six law school students on that trip and trained them there. And we found that what was really interesting is the program empowers both groups of students. So the undergraduates, for instance, on that Hasbara Fellowship trip, they have a program where the students sit around talking about what's up on their campus. And it used to be like a group therapy session where the students would talk about how depressing and how miserable it was. And in order to end on an up note, they would then, the second half of the discussion, say, well, tell us about a success story on your campus. But when we brought the law students in, the law students started peppering the undergraduates with questions. Well, your posters were vandalized, right? They were trying, did you report that, right? That's a criminal offense. You can actually file a police report for that. Your event was shut down. Did you know that in pretty much all 50 states, there are laws on the books that make it a criminal offense to deliberately shout down and shut down a speaker in a program? You can file, and that's what Asaf was referring to. We worked with students at UCLA to file police reports when that happened, when there was an egregious event disruption. So our undergraduates, suddenly when they realized that they have the law on their side, they sat up and they're like, well, how about me? How about me? What can I do now? And so our law students are working with the undergraduates to help guide and help advise them. And for the law students, they feel empowered because now they've actually been given the training to provide assistance that they feel is enormously valued and is really making a difference. So that's another one of our programs. And then they're helping also document what's been going on. Because one of the biggest challenges that we found is if you want to bring a successful lawsuit or a successful Title VI complaint, you have to have the evidence of discrimination. And students don't know how to document. They don't understand what needs to be documented. So the Jigsaw Fellows are working with the students to document so that if the education of the administrators doesn't work, if working with the students and having the students try and articulate to the campus what needs to be done to make change, if that doesn't effectuate change and you have to go the avenue of filing a Title VI complaint with the Department of Education or a lawsuit, we have the documentation and the evidence to be able to do that. So that's how we're working at the Brandeis Center. And anybody can reach out to us, info@brandeiscenter.com, if you are experiencing anti-Semitism on your campus, or if you're a law student and you're interested in being trained as part of our Jigsaw program. As I say, please reach out to us at info@brandeiscenter.com and we'll be happy to help you.
Thanks, Alyza. It's been a little over an hour, and I know there are a couple questions that I've gotten, that I've received. If people are willing to stay for a little bit longer, I'll just throw out a couple final questions, and we can, answer them on a relatively brief basis. And everybody, feel free to chime in. Somebody sent in a question: why don't we have, or how can we get a more unified, predictable, and tangible response on campuses? She recommended erecting counter walls to the Israel apartheid walls, have like a security wall set up with facts, which I think some people might do. She mentioned scattering kites and balloons on campuses with information tags at the end, discussing how many acres of land have been burned in southern Israel. Are there unified activities taking place? And Asaf, one of the things we didn't get to is the faculty, and that could be a whole hour discussion also, but SPM in particular works with faculty. So I'm going to actually, Asaf, throw this one out to you really, to start with what you see on campus in terms of.
Well, I think that some of those initiatives are happening to the question. I think that one needs to understand that every campus is culturally, politically different. And every year there's also a crop of new student leaders. And so, and there are different challenges. And so, yes, in counter to the Israel apartheid, month, which takes place, usually at the beginning of March, there are peace walls. There's an attempt to kind of highlight the issue. Some student groups prefer to talk about the good news from Israel, the start of a nation. They don't want to deal with the political, cultural, and political historical environment as a result of the political toxicity when they're looking to try to create overtures into other groups. So it varies. And I think that that's what I was referring to before. The opposition is extremely monolithic. And I think that every student that I have worked with groups, I always recommend to expand the narrative. Reach out to college Ds and college Rs, talk about the Middle East in general, try to talk about, where you could find collaboration. You could, reach out to other groups on campus to try to take away from the hypersensitive focus just on the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic and look at other issues. Look at minorities in the Middle East. Look at Christians in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism. Muslim anti-Semitism. Look at a variety of Copts. And look at this is a larger issue that needs to expand upon as far as dissecting the Middle East. And I think that there are campaigns going around. Some of them that all of us on the here. EMET, Brandeis, SPME, and other groups have been part of national campaigns and whatnot, trying to put pressure and showing issues, especially when it comes to dealing with the larger campaigns, the ethnic study problem in California and things of the sort. But on the student level, I mean, it varies. I mean, and you have to deal with every year with a crop of new students, which is why, again, part of the reason, apropos SPME, why we focus on faculty, not on students, because faculty stay forever, students come and go. So from a long-term benefit, we believe that we got to deal with the permanent fixtures while we work with the ongoing new crop of students every year. And there has to be also an ongoing grooming of new leadership every time, you know, where there are new challenges and new problems that people need to deal with. And so, again, you have to like dissect each part of the campuses. And also, I believe firmly that both groups, both constituents, faculty and administrators need students and vice versa. You make a stronger case on campus if you have collaboration. Apropos, you know, campaigns. The opposition, most SJP groups have faculty advisors, and their faculty advisors are either of Arab Palestinian descent or of Muslim descent, and they help promote the cause. Most student groups on campuses don't always have enough faculty to stand up and help them make the case. Part of what we're trying to do is help make those bridges, and it's not easy. It's not easy at all, and this is part of where the heavy lifting takes place because of the courage it takes to stand up to a lot of these issues on a variety of campuses.
Thanks, Asaf. Sarah, someone sent me a follow-up to the discussion about what's going on the Hill and the upcoming elections, and the fear that if the Republicans lose the Senate and, you know, the Democrats retain the House, we lose the White House, you know, what happens really to this Title, the Title VI executive order, whether it stays, whether it goes, what other avenues are there legislative avenues? Is there anything else that we can do through the Department of Education maybe to protect students on campuses?
Well, actually, one of the things that I would love to work with you, Lauri, about, and we've discussed this already, is to work together on a petition for rulemaking, which does not come and go in terms of which political party is in power. It is an agency rule. So if we want to set down, for example, the executive order as an agency rule, we can do that through petition rulemaking. There are many, there are many problems here that I'd love to address, and I think we're going to get together. And if Alyza, Asaf, anybody else wants to help us with this, because this is a many-faceted problem. But I am worried because of all the vicissitudes, the political vicissitudes and the waves that, this executive order might actually collapse. I think that's what Virginia Fox was trying to do by inserting this amendment into a bill. But it's still, there are very, very few calendar days left to this congressional calendar. They're recessing for politics, and there's Christmas, but we do have a lot of friends on Capitol Hill, and I am not giving up in total on the entire Democratic Party. There are people like Bob Casey who came along, and there are other people who come along that, when the problem is put to them squarely. But it's an uphill battle. And I'm going to, and any other attorney, I've never written a petition for rulemaking. It was suggested to me by someone high up in the administration. And I'm not an attorney, but any attorney that would like to help us with this, I would love to do that so that we can have certain sacred cows that will not be slaughtered as a result of this election.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really looking forward to working on that with you. We also, Sarah and Asaf and I, and I'm sure Alyza would love to participate, have also discussed focusing on K through 12 education, which could be, again, another whole topic of conversation, because the indoctrination is starting at very young ages so that the kids are all primed by the time they get to campus to soak up the bad stuff. Alyza, do you see any hope that the academy can be saved?
So the answer to that is yes, but there is one, that's a quick answer, but there is one point that I do think is important for the viewers today to understand too, which we haven't really touched on. And I think that is another difficulty that we've had is distinguishing between the individuals when they critique Israel or when they criticize Israel, trying to distinguish and identify who are the folks who really genuinely are seeking coexistence and believe that in this tiny piece of land, Jews and Arabs should be able to live together and that's their ultimate goal. And who are the folks who are criticizing Israel because their end goal is really the destruction of the one and only Jewish state? They don't believe that there's any right to a Jewish homeland, that Jews have no right to be there. They want to push the Jews into the sea, and there should be no Jewish state of Israel. That's always been the challenge, is how do you identify who's who and who's on which side of that divide? And I actually think that the recent UAE and Bahrain, peace agreements with Israel provide us a wonderful opportunity to try and push a wide open and create a very bold division between which side of this divide are you now on, right? Because what did the UAE do? What was the first act that they did as soon as it was announced that they were going to be entering a peace agreement with Israel? Is in very public fashion, they canceled their Israel boycott law to cheers from their public. They have an enormous percentage of Palestinians who actually live in the UAE. These are Palestinians who are not abandoning the Palestinian cause. These are Palestinians who recognize that the way to peace and prosperity for the Palestinians is through coexistence, through normalization of relations with Israel, not boycotting Israel. Boycotting Israel and anti-normalization is not the way to peace. It's not the way, right? These are like the Palestinians who worked for companies like SodaStream, who recognize that coexistence is possible, but BDS, right? BDS's goal, as Asaf was saying, Omar Barghouti slipped not long ago in one of his presentations and made clear, BDS's goal is not coexistence. BDS's goal is the destruction of the one and only Jewish state. So now the question is, where is the Palestinian Authority leadership? Well, the Palestinian Authority leadership, instead of allying itself with the UAE, the Gulf states, Bahrain, the others that are looking to normalize relations, it's moving closer and closer to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to the terrorist organizations that have made clear and have always been explicit that their goal is the destruction of the one and only Jewish state. So now the question on campus is, are you like the Abdul Hadi, Professor Abdul Hadi, who promotes the terrorist Leila Khalid, who does not believe in coexistence? Is your goal to destroy the one and only Jewish state? Or do you align yourself with the Gulf states that recognize that normalization is the way? Just the other day, there was a 2-hour Zoom session with journalists and members of the Israeli government and reporters from UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Algeria for 2 hours to discuss what role the media can play in forging peace. Compare this, a 2-hour conversation where they engage with each other, to what happened at NYU 2 years ago when 53 student groups pledged not only to boycott Israel, but to boycott all the pro-Israel groups on campus. And when NYU brought in a professional facilitator to facilitate a dialogue among those groups, just to get them to talk, to respectfully listen to one another, the anti-Zionists came to that meeting and said, we're not going to talk to the Zionists. So it was supposed to be a 1.5-hour discussion turned into a 2.5-hour talk about whether or not the anti-Zionists would even deign to dialogue with the Zionists. That's what we have going on campus, is not an effort to reform the policies of the government of Israel, right? That's not what the criticism is. Because if you don't believe that the Jewish state has a right to exist, then your criticism is not intended to reform the policies of the government of Israel. Your criticism is intended to destroy the one and only Jewish state. And that is anti-Semitic. So today on campus, we need to be asking people, why are you pushing BDS when all of these countries realize that boycott is not the answer? So are you pushing boycott because you really don't believe in coexistence and your end goal is not coexistence and you're allying yourself with the terrorists? Or will you give up on BDS and stop pushing to boycott Israel and recognize, like the Gulf countries now do, that the answer is normalization and engagement with Israel?
Thanks, Alyza. I will add that, speaking of the Palestinian Authority and their representatives and coexistence, that Harvard, as I mentioned this at the beginning, I just want to remind everybody that Harvard just hired Saeed Erekat to mentor students in diplomacy. And this is the Palestinian representative that has turned down every peace initiative over the past several decades and is now going to be mentoring students at Harvard, our higher learning institutions. I think we have to end the webinar now as it's gone well over our intended time, but we can continue this discussion maybe in a future time. Thank you all. You all are dear friends, and I really cherish the opportunity to work with you on these critically important issues. I hope everybody checks out the websites for SPME, EMET, and Brandeis, and please give us all your support. Feel free to reach out if you have any other questions after the webinar, and thank you all. Stay well.
Thank you.